Howdy everyone! For today's Jolly Lark, I'm going to show you how to paint a really ancient, antiqued, time-worn armor. I'm doing this on some Conquest Old Dominion Legionnaires, which are great models that are 38 millimeters scale, so they're a little bit bigger than your regular miniatures. I've really been enjoying painting these, and the larger scale makes them easier to paint and a little bit easier to video. We're going to start things off with a pretty heavy dry brush using a big old flat brush from the arts and crafts store. This is not a hobby brush. This is a much larger, probably 3/4 of an inch wide brush. And I'm going to do an all over dry brush of copper. You can use any copper color you like. In this case, I'm using the Pro-Acryl Copper. I like their metallics. Wish they had kind of a nice medium brass color. But other than that, I really like their metallics a lot. I'm using their copper for this. But my goal is not for the final miniature to actually look like copper armor. That could be a cool look. If you like how the copper looks, you could leave it as copper armor, but that's not the look I'm going for. I want something that's a little more like an early, steel, iron alloy that's been left out in the sun and buried under the dirt and been through, dozens of battles. Something that really looks downright decrepit. Without just looking like it's covered in rust. And doing an army that was very a rusted steel, a rusted iron army, also a cool look, but not what I'm shooting for. I'm looking for old, but not falling apart. So starting with the copper will give us kind of a discolored tone once we start adding in more colors, and we'll bring it up to more of a weathered, discolored ancient iron versus a rusty, falling apart iron. So before we move on to the next step, again, this is just copper all over. I'm not worrying about getting the copper on any of the cloth or the feathers or the bones or anything like that. These models have lots of detail. These are the Old Dominion Legionnaires from the Conquest range, kind of an undead Roman feel to the army. Once you've got the copper down on all the miniatures, we're going to move on to some of the weathering effects. For this one, I'm going to use the Vallejo Dark Rust Wash. This is a clear, dark red wash that we're going to use in patches to kind of add some of the weathered effect to the miniatures. As I'm putting this on, I'm really putting it on without a lot of rhyme or reason, trying to put it on essentially as randomly as possible. Putting it on where I'm putting it on in relatively thick spots. But I'm, and you can say I'm putting a decent amount, but it's not quite all over. I'm going for kind of a patchy look, putting it in some places, but not in others. And that patchiness will help sell the effect of it being weathered, antiqued metal. As metal ages, you see a lot of irregularities in the patina and finish, and that's part of what we're going for here. So kind of just keep going. It's really up to you how much of this you want to add. You can add a little more, you can add a little less. And you can see here that it's really this is a clear layer. A red-brown contrast paint would work well here too. It's something like Fire Slayer's Flesh or the Dark Oath Flesh, but the Vallejo Mecha Dark Rust color is a little more transparent and will show the metallic paint through the red a little bit better. So I'll show you another one of these here. I'm really doing this fast. I'm painting a whole unit of these guys, batch painting a whole unit of these guys on the Jolly Lark painting handles, which should be available in stores soon. Put a little plug in for those. But pretty random, pretty sloppy. This can go fast. Don't spend too long. This is really just kind of putting down a base layer for your weathering. It doesn't really matter where it goes yet. In future steps, we're going to try to define the lighting a little bit more, try to create some of the lighting volume to make it look lighter on top, darker on the bottom, but that's not what we're doing here. This is just kind of putting down a patchwork of red blobs to give the irregular surface that I'm shooting for with the weathered metals. Just want to show you a quick side-by-side here. Maybe this would be useful to see. Here's the one on the left that's gotten the patchy rust wash, and the one on the left that just has the copper dry brush. So you still see the copper in places, but there's a good bit of rust on there. So with that patchy, reddish, brown, rusty copper layer settled on there, as the next step, we're going to add a layer of Citadel Druchii Violet. This is one of their shade colors that's not as pigmented as the contrast and is more transparent. And with this violet wash, we're going to start adding in some of the shadows that weren't really created in the previous steps. Because even with metallic color schemes, you still want to create the same sort of light and shadows that you would be working with if you were painting blue or red or something like that. So with the violet, what I'm going to do is just get this into all of the areas of the miniature that would be more shadowed if you imagine the light shining down from above. So that's behind the shield. Put some of the violet kind of on the lower half of his face, the lower part of his chest, the lower part of the helmet. You can imagine all the chunks of the miniature, the helmet, the chest plate, the shield, the legs, the chest. And I'm putting some the violet shade kind of on the lower half of each of those chunks. That'll just kind of help give the look that there's shadows falling on the different parts of the miniatures. Now, you certainly could use a black wash for this, but I found when trying to paint on a more ancient weathered metals, going for a purple or a green actually helps sell the effect of the old metal more. If you go out and look at a really aged, rusty, old piece of metal, there's often more color than you realize. Different colors in the patina. There's obviously, green on bronze and stuff like that. And also if you look at heat-treated metals or old steel pans and stuff like that, the muzzles of guns, that sort of thing, you often end up with kind of a purple hazing on the metal. So purple's a nice dark color that can fill in for shadows and suggests some of that, further suggests the story that this is a really ancient, weathered, sun-beaten metal armor. Now, I'm using a shade paint here because the shade paints are much thinner and flow into the cracks more. And the other thing that I want to be doing in this step is defining some of the deeper lines and filling them in with that dark purple to kind of block out the areas of the miniature a little bit more. You can really see it on the flower pattern there on the banner. That really fast, rough copper dry brush we did ends up getting some copper in the nooks and crannies of the miniature, and adding a layer of the shade paint can help redefine those areas and bring back some of the detail on the miniature that got kind of plastered over by that rough dry brush of copper. So going in with the shade, which really flows into the cracks of the miniature, can help those details pop a little bit more. So don't be afraid to add some of that purple to any line on the miniature that you think would benefit from just a little bit more definition. On the previous Legionnaire, I put a little bit of purple at the top of the shield, like so, just to kind of make that overhang look a little bit brighter. Even on the top of the helmet, putting a little bit of purple at the base of the crest helps define the details there just a little bit more. So next up, I'm just going to block in all the areas that are not going to be weathered metal. The tabards, the skeletal faces, the skeletal hands, any feathers on the headdresses, stuff like that. Just blocking this in with the Pro-Acryl khaki color, which has really nice coverage, even though it's a light color, and provides a good base for using shade paints or contrast paints, washes on top of it later. So I'm kind of largely fast forward, skip past this, because all I'm doing is blocking in basically all the areas that are going to be something other than the ancient metal armor. Now, I know the next thing I'm going to do is going to be a brown shading wash all over the miniature. So the other thing you can do is to add a little bit of color in now that will then get hit by the brown wash later. And this can help to age the colors of the tabard or the robes or anything else that's on your miniature by adding some of the color now before putting in your brown wash. Now, if you want, you could save all this other work till after you finish the metal, and that might not be a bad idea because it lets you be a little bit easier and looser with the final dry brush on the metal. On the other hand, doing it now means that you can wash the cloth areas with the same brown weathering washes as we're going to use on the armor, which can save a little bit of time. So that's really up to you of what you feel more comfortable with. If you'd rather be able to just slap on that final dry brushing onto the metal that we're going to see in a few minutes, you can wait and do the cloth after and then just wash it separately. If you feel comfortable with a more precise dry brushing strategy, you can do the cloth now and save a little bit of time when it comes to washing the whole miniature. Really, either way works, and it's just up to you about what you feel more comfortable with. Now, for the next weathering layer, I'm going to add on some of the GARAGHAK'S Sewer. This is from the second wave of a Citadel contrast paints that came out. Might be my favorite color from that range. I'm going to dilute it with a little bit of AIRBRUSH medium. I find that works a little bit better than water, just for having it stick well to the surface and not form puddles. And I'm going for a pretty all-over wash of this. Kind of knock down the brightness of the armor. Every layer of stuff we add on top of the metallics dulls them a little bit more, makes them look a little bit older. And as a contrast paint, this does flow into the curves while also still tinting the raised ones. And if you want, just like I did, wipe it off with your finger. Fingers are finger paint your miniatures. Fingers are a terrific tool sometimes for wiping a little bit of contrast paint off the top ridges. And you can see on the skirt there that just giving it a quick swipe with my finger lifted the paint off the tips and made the contrast a little bit more dramatic. So with this, again, similar to the purple, I'm kind of trying to put it all over the shadowed areas and leave the tops of the chunks a little bit brighter. So any downward facing areas, the lower parts of the chest, the lower parts of the helmet, all over the legs, the boots, so you're kind of painting in the shadows. You probably don't want to put much of this brown mixture on any of the upwards facing surfaces of the miniature. And that'll keep it looking bright from up top and having dramatic shadows as the surfaces of the miniature kind of move downward. One of the things that's nice about using the airbrush medium to dilute the contrast instead of water is that you can more easily put the wash on part of a surface, but not the whole surface, without getting any of those kind of coffee stains, watermarks on the areas where the wash ends. So you can put some wash, on the lower parts of an area, but not on the upper parts of the same surface, like that shoulder pad here. I'm being pretty liberal with this, trying to put it in the cracks and crevices, trying to put it on the pretty much all over the lower part of the miniature. Again, don't be afraid to swipe with your fingers. Look at how that brightens up those folds there, just like that. But trying to be have a little lighter touch with the brown wash on the raised parts and the upward facing parts of the miniature. Not zero, not nothing, but just a little less. And in an effort to be efficient, I also went ahead and grabbed a pot of Nuln oil, which is Citadel's black shade paint. I'm just going to give a quick layer of the black shade to the feathers and the skin areas. I want to differentiate them a little bit from the rest of the miniature and not have them have the brown shading. So we'll just put a little bit of black shading on the skin and the feathers for this color scheme. Just mark them out a little bit different. Being shaded in a different color will just help them stand out a little bit from the rest of the miniature. Now, for the next step, I'm going to do a light dry brush of Pro-Acryl Light Bronze all over the metal areas of the miniature. So at this point, all the washes have dried. We've got kind of a cool looking coppery armor, which, honestly, if this is the look you were going for your miniature, looks pretty cool. I don't mind the look of a copper armor, just not the weathered ancient look I was going for, but it is a neat look. So with the Pro-Acryl Light Bronze, giving this a much lighter dry brush than we did with the copper. We're just trying to hit the edges, hit the raised portion, kind of the raised upward portions of the armor to both bring out the raised details and create a sense of light hitting the miniature from above. Now, to repeat something I said earlier, this probably would be easier if I had done this before painting any of the tabards or the feathers and other details. But to each their own. I think you could be a little freer and easier with this step if you weren't worrying about getting the light bronze onto the cloth areas. But it also doesn't hurt to kind of force you to be careful there. So again, kind of a very lightly dry brushing. And just while you watch me do this here, just touching on dry brushing real quick. When I say dry brushing, and this might be worth a basics video on its own, I'm putting a little bit of paint on the brush. I'm using an old junky brush, a little bit of paint on the brush, wiping most of that paint off on one of the blue lint-free paper towels, and then kind of swiping the brush very, very lightly, just kind of tickling the miniature with the bristles of the brush, and the raised areas will pick up the light bronze color off the brush. And you can see in that side by side there of one of the Legionnaires that I have and I haven't dry brushed. The Legionnaire that I haven't dry brushed is looking much darker, kind of like it's standing in the shade, whereas the Legionnaire that got the light bronze dry brush kind of looks like sunlight is hitting him from above, and that's what we're shooting for. So tread lightly with the dry brushing, just a little bit on the raised areas, go a little heavier on the upper half of the torso and the head, the upper, maybe quarter, third of the shield, and you'll get that kind of sun-kissed light from above look that we're shooting for. The other thing that this dry brush of light bronze is doing is making the whole ancient armor look like ancient worn steel instead of looking like copper or brass, adding this brighter silvery highlight layer kind of changes the eye's perception of the metal from being that orangey copper to being a more silvery metal that has aged in the shadows where the water has accumulated, and just makes the whole armor, it kind of just changes the tone of the armor. When painting with metallic paints, that final highlight is really important for setting the tone of the armor, because our eyes kind of think that where the sun is hitting it is the real color of the armor. So if you wanted to go for a similar look but have a brassier, bronzer color, you could choose something like a true brass or a gold or something like that, and do everything the same up till right now, but just by switching up the highlight color on the armor, really change the feel of the miniature. Now, for this next step, I'm going to grab some Pro-Acryl burnt sienna and one of my junkiest small brushes and start just doing a little stippling, that is, just kind of poking at the miniature with the tips of the bristles to create some patches of this reddish brown color. You can use any reddish brown color that works for you. I think that the burnt sienna is good for it, but most paint ranges have something like this that's kind of an orangey, rusty brown. Just little bits all over, again, similar to the rust wash earlier. I'm trying to be somewhat random here. Just put some little poke, little stippled on patches at different places on the miniature. You can go heavier or lighter. And honestly, you could skip this step if you're happy with how the armor looks now. I wanted to add a little bit more weathering to it. But if this is starting to feel like a lot of steps, you could stop now and already you've got a pretty cool looking armor effect. But I'm going to keep going to make the armor look even a little bit more ancient and crusty. This next step will kind of add even more of that variation that we've been shooting for all along. This is another good opportunity to use your fingers, because as you poke some of this burnt sienna, kind of rusty brown, onto the miniatures, it's a good idea to wipe it off the most raised areas. So you kind of poke at the miniature with the rust brown, and then you can kind of use your finger to wipe it off any raised ridges or edges. Now, obviously, I'm painting one of the Old Dominion Legionnaires in this video, but these exact same techniques could be used on any miniature that you want to have this sort of effect. This would look cool on something like Iron Warriors. This would look cool on Caradhran for Age of Sigmar. There's lots of different miniatures where having an ancient metal armor would be a cool look. I think an army of Chaos Warriors done in this style would look great. So as you go through, again, just kind of poke with a little bit of the rust. Try to keep it random. Wipe the rust color off any raised edges, and go through all the miniatures you're working on with just a little bit of that rust brown here and there. For this next step, I'm going to take some watered down Pro-Acryl Dark Yellow Green, and this is watered down a good bit, probably 1 part paint to 3 or 4 parts water. And I'm just going to put a little, again, similar to the rust, little dibs and dabs, poke a little here, poke a little there, It can overlap with the rust you did earlier. You can put a little bit of this green on the cloth and the feathers. I think that looks good too. Just again, trying to create a little bit of variation in the surface of the metal, and maybe taking 10 seconds per model just to put some little spots of this watered down yet kind of yellow green on different parts of the miniature. Across a whole unit of miniatures, you're going to get that cohesive look of a regiment of miniatures by having the same basic color of armor, the same color of tabards and cloth and feathers and stuff like that. And these little bits of variation in the armor will really help sell the effect that this is some cool, weathered, ancient armor. And you can see, looking at my palette paper down below there and paper towel, we're really using a lot of different colors to end up with something that looks very natural. And the next color in that rainbow of colors down there is a bright orange. You can use any bright orange you like. I'm a big fan of the Pro-Acryl orange, and this is really watered down. This is probably 1 part paint to 9 or 10 parts water. And we're going to paint a little bit of this into some of the cracks and the crevices. This bright orange is just going to settle in there to look like a little bit of rust, a little bit of corrosion, just some little spots and patches. And it's watery enough that it's going to add a very slight effect. Go in for something here that's pretty subtle. We're not shooting for a falling apart rust bucket sort of look to the armor, just little bits of orange throughout. Now for the next step, we're going to grab some of the Citadel Nihilakh Oxide, which is kind of a verdigris, sort of aquamarine wash. Again, with the goal here is to make an armor that kind of is of ambiguous material and an ancient alloy. So we're going to add all the weathering effects. We added a little bit of a bright orange rustiness, and now we're going to add a little bit of a verdigris sort of bronze that you'd see on bronze and brass and copper. Now, for this, I'm very specifically not using it all over. Adding any sort of this green verdigris is going to immediately make the area that you put it on look like it's aged brass, bronze, copper. So I'm using that to good advantage by just putting it on some specific spots of the armor to make it look like that part of the armor is made out of a different sort of metal. Because up until this point, you could really take the armor that we've made and go either way with it. You could add a lot more rust and make it really look like rusted out steel, or you could add the verdigris all over and probably end up with something that really looks like an aged brass, aged bronze. But by only adding it to some small selected areas of the miniature, it kind of makes those elements look like they're a brass bronze, adds a little bit of color variation to the miniature, and still maintains the overall look of this being more of a steel type armor. But you're adding a little bit of the Nihilakh Oxide to some icons, to some details on the armor, to on this miniature, some of the little belt buckle plates there. It adds that feel of the oxidized verdigris weathering without doing it all over, which would totally change the look of the miniature. But still get in some of that color. The green of this and the orange from the rust. Green and orange are a great color combination. And again, the effect we're going for is that really like that Technicolor weathered metal that you get from very, very old metal that has a real variety of colors on it. Some of the miniatures in this unit might only get 3 or 4 little spots of the oxide paint. Some you could give none at all. There's a really quick dab on a couple little spots. But it's these sort of little finishing touches and extra details that I think make the unit as a whole look really sharp. Next up, we're going to add a little bit of mildewy, moldiness with some Citadel Contrast Creed Camo. This is a kind of a more Kelly green, darker contrast paint. It's not super thick straight out of the bottle. I think it works pretty well straight out of the bottle to just rub a little bit of moldering on especially the cloth areas, the skin and the bones of these undead warriors. Just kind of dabbing it on again, not washing it all over, but just adding a little bit of green patchiness to some of the cloth bits on the warriors. I'm not putting this on the armor. I'm just using this to increase the effect of age on the miniature overall by adding a little bit of greenness to some of the patches of both cloth and skin. It can look good to add a little bit of green to the bottoms of hanging cloth to look like they got wet and then dried moldy. Now, these Undead Legionnaires are, remnants of a once great empire, so I thought it would look cool to try to make it look like on their shields, there was chipped, fading gold gilt, like parts of their shields used to be like covered in gold leaf. So to achieve that effect, I'm going to get another kind of old, spread out, junky brush, and with Pro-Acryl Bright Gold, which is a gold color that has pretty good coverage, kind of press a little bit of gold paint into some of the cracks and crevices of the shields in the surrounding areas, and then use my finger where needed to wipe it off the raised areas. Because have you ever seen like a really old antique mirror that has a picture frame that has wood with gold leaf on it? The gold leaf wears away on the raised areas, and you end up with kind of a darker raised areas with the gold settling into the cracks. So to achieve that effect, and it also kind of comes off in patches and flakes because it's just, an atom or two thin layer of gold on top of something else. So just dabbing a little bit of the gold on top of the ancient armor can kind of give a neat effect, like it used to have gold flake on this shield design. And because gold doesn't tarnish and gold doesn't rust, it also makes sense for the gold, even if it's hundreds, thousands of years old, the gold would still be nice and bright. Just like you see on the sarcophagus of an Egyptian pharaoh or something, the gold is still really lustrous and bright, even while everything else has faded and aged. So, to replicate that effect, we're putting the gold on after all the other weathering. And so you can see that on the shield here, kind of looks like a layer of flaky gold leaf on top of an ancient metal shield. And we don't want the gold to look weathered and tarnished, but we do want to add a little bit of shading. So we're going to grab the Citadel Seraphim Sepia shade and just add a really, really light layer of just a very, very light touch wash of the Seraphim Sepia on all of the gold areas. That'll give the gold just a little bit more definition where it crosses a crack or a crevice or a border, like so. I'll show you on another miniature here, just adding a little bit of sepia on any area of gold. And because we've used so many clear reddish washes all over the rest of it, it's okay if that sepia wash spills onto other areas. I've done gold face masks for these guys, so they get a Seraphim Sepia wash all over their face too. Gold makes a nice accent color with this color scheme. The laurels on the top of the banner here I've painted in kind of an all-over gold to be kind of a focal point for the unit. So these will just get a wash of Seraphim Sepia all over too. This is a really quick, easy way to paint gold with the bright gold base coat and then washing in some Seraphim Sepia into the cracks and crevices. Hopefully you're finding these useful. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me in the comments below. I'm usually pretty quick to respond to any hobby questions. My focus as a hobbyist is usually getting units of miniatures done and ready for the tabletop pretty quickly. Speed painting sometimes makes it seem like you're doing a very basic, slapdash job of it. But that doesn't have to be the case. You can put a little thought and time, add some extra details, and really make your miniatures stand out nicely on the tabletop, and don't spend too long doing it. So that's why I usually on my videos try to point out a stage where you could stop and have a decent looking miniature, but then also how to take it a little bit further. So if that's the kind of thing you like, if you think these videos are interesting, really appreciate if you like and subscribe. It really does help grow the channel, helps attract more people. The more people who like and subscribe, the more people who find the videos, which is great. So as we're wrapping up here, as a final step, if you want to darken the miniature up even a little bit more, you can grab a pot of Nuln oil. And I'm going in here with a pretty good, big, thick brush. This is a size 4 brush. And just adding a little bit more Nuln oil, which is a very thin black wash, and only applying it to what would be the very darkest parts of the miniature. Making the darkest parts of the miniature a little bit darker also then helps the brightest parts of the miniature look a little bit brighter. So next I'm going to get in really close. I put on my macro lens for this and show you a little detail I added to some of the faces, which is just adding a little bit of a medium brown color to the raised part of the gold masks, to again, a detail on the face to make it look like the gold had worn away just a little bit from the tips of their noses and the tips of their chins. So the other detail I wanted to show you up close here is going in to the gold leaf parts, and I'm going to add a little bit of kind of a flaking shadow around the edges of the gold leaf with a 0.005 micron pen. And I'm just going to go in and kind of basically trace the outlines of the gold leaf to give it more of the effect that it's lifting off of the miniature and just create a little bit of a, almost like a shadowiness to the gold leaf, a couple little dots, where it might have holes in it, just kind of sell the effect that this is flaking gold leaf a little bit more. You can kind of give it a little bit rub while the ink is still dry to smudge it a little bit. Just to dirty it up a little bit, or if you don't like a line that you just drew. And I think that gives it a neat look. It kind of gives it a little bit, the gold, a little bit more separation from the rest of the armor, and makes it look like it's raised up off the surface of the armor just a little bit more. When you note that, you end up with something like this. We've got the gold face mask. This is the net effect of all the different weathering techniques we've added. None of this took that long. To paint 12 of these guys was a couple hours, which is not too bad. And I think that's a really neat, straight from an ancient empire weathered armor effect. I think these are going to look great as a whole army of ancient soldiers. For the Conquest game, they get based up on multi-bases like so. I kind of skip ahead here because I just released a cracked desert basing video recently that I'll put a link to in the comments below. I used exactly that technique for these, and for Conquest they get glued 4 miniatures to a base, so I've based them up like that, and I really think they just look really sharp as a whole regiment of ancient armored warriors. There we go. Can't wait to paint more of these. Hopefully you found this useful. Thank you so much for liking the video, subscribing to the channel. Hit me up with any questions you have below, and we'll see you next time for another Jolly Lark.